Hello and welcome back to my channel and welcome back to the Bible Study with Me series we're doing through the book of Esther. Today's video we're going to be in Esther chapter 5, so if you haven't already, make sure you go back and watch the videos we did on Esther's 1 through 4. But a little refresher on the context of this book. So Esther is a historical narrative set in Susa, which is the capital city of the ancient Persian Empire, this massive empire ruled by King Hazaris. And it tells the story of a Jewish community living in this empire. They were among those who did not return to Jerusalem after the Babylonian exile. And so it's this Jewish community living in the Persian Empire, and it's this story of a Jewish maiden from among that Jewish community who God uses to save her people. Like we've been talking about all throughout the book of Esther, God's name is actually not even mentioned one time, but though God's name isn't in this book, his hand certainly is. And all throughout this book, we've been seeing how God is working behind the scenes to orchestrate things and to bring about his purposes. Another refresher on the theme statement from this book, I got this from the Bible Project. It says that God's seeming absence does not mean he has abandoned his people. He uses the faithfulness of even morally compromised people living in a messy world to accomplish his purposes and fulfill his promises. This book asks us to trust God even when we can't see him working, and to hold to the confident hope that no matter how bad things get, God is actively working to redeem his world. Again, that statement comes from the Bible Project, and the Bible Project, along with all the other resources I use and reference, are linked down below: sermons, commentaries, journal, highlighter, Bible, all of that. And so now let's do a little refresher on the story so far. So again, this is everything we've covered in chapters 1 through 4. So first of all, we have King Hazaris, who again is the king of this Persian Empire, holds this extravagant 6-month party, and at the end of it asks his wife, Queen Vashti, to parade her beauty in front of his drunken friends. She refuses and is kicked out of the role of queen. 4 years later, the king returns from an unsuccessful military conquest and remembers what happened with Vashti and holds essentially this beauty contest to select a new queen. And then we have Esther, this Jewish maiden, chosen as queen. 5 years later, Esther has now been queen for 5 years. Her cousin Mordecai has been elevated to a position in the king's court, and this man named Haman is promoted to a position essentially second in line behind the king. We talked a lot in chapter 3 about Haman's ancestry. He is an Agagite and the significance of that to this story. But Haman is promoted. Everybody is bowing down and paying homage to him. Everybody except Mordecai. Mordecai refuses, and this makes Haman furious. And so he devises a plot to kill not only Mordecai, but his entire people group, which are the Jews. And then he gets together with his comrades to cast lots to determine when this evil plan is going to be executed. And it's determined that it's going to be 11 months from then. And so we've got 11 months now before the Jews are going to be destroyed. And Mordecai urges Esther, who is a Jew, to go before the king, her husband, to plead for her people. But like we talked about in chapter 4, she hasn't actually been invited in to see the king for over 30 days, and it's actually illegal for her to go into his court without being summoned, and she could be killed for it. But Mordecai reminds her that if she stays silent, that God will rise up deliverance from another place. But who's to say that she is going to be safe, because she is also a Jew? And then he says that famous line from the book of Esther that most of us have heard before of, "What's to say that you weren't created for such a time as this?" And so Esther decides that she is going to act, but first she calls this 3-day fast to prepare for her going in to see the king and having this conversation. And she says, if I perish, I perish, but essentially I'm going to do this. And so that is how chapter 4 ends, which leads us to today, chapter 5. And Esther chapter 5 has 2 main subheadings. The first is that Esther prepares a banquet, which covers verses 1 through 8. And then the second is Haman plans to hang Mordecai, which covers verses 9 through 14. But like we've been doing in this study, we're just going to read through the entire chapter without stopping and then walk back and unpack it all. And we'll be pulling out those biblical principles, but as a reminder, we're going to go through a comprehensive list of all the different biblical principles or sort of lessons we can learn from Esther in the chapter 10 video. So we'll just go ahead and get into it. But before we do, if you haven't already, please be sure to subscribe to my channel. That is a huge way that you can help to support what I'm doing here and helping me continue to make more Bible study series. And then also give this video a thumbs up if you've been enjoying this study. And let's just go ahead and get into it. If you have a Bible, turn with me to Esther chapter 5. Verse 1. On the third day, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace in front of the king's quarters, while the king was sitting on his royal throne inside the throne room opposite the entrance to the palace. And when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she won favor in his sight, and he held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. Then Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. And the king said to her, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given you even to the half of my kingdom." And Esther said, "If it please the king, let the king and Haman come today to a feast that I have prepared for the king." Then the king said, "Bring Haman quickly, so that we may do as Esther has asked." So the king and Haman came to the feast that Esther had prepared. And as they were drinking wine after the feast, the king said to Esther, "What is your wish? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Even to the half of my kingdom it shall be fulfilled." Then Esther answered, "My wish and my request is, if I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it please the king to grant my wish and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come to the feast that I will prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king has said." And Haman went out that day joyful and glad of heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, that he neither rose nor trembled before him, he was filled with wrath against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home, and he sent and brought his friends and his wife Zeresh. And Haman recounted to them the splendor of his riches, the number of his sons, all the promotions with which the king had honored him, and how he had advanced him above the officials and the servants of the king. Then Haman said, "Even Queen Esther, let no one but me come with the king to the feast she prepared. And tomorrow also I am invited by her together with the king. Yet all this is worth nothing to me, so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate." Then his wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, "Let a gallows 50 cubits high be made, and in the morning tell the king to have Mordecai hanged upon it. Then go joyfully with the king to the feast." This idea pleased Haman, and he had the gallows made. All right, let's unpack that a little bit. So the very first verse in chapter 5, verse 1, it says, "On the third day, Esther put on her royal robes." So this is a reminder that Esther has held this 3-day fast to prepare for this risky act of going in to talk to the king. So she doesn't act before intentionally taking it to God, because she knows that he is her ultimate power, that apart from him she can do nothing. And so she takes that time to prepare, to fast, and to pray. Next, I want to read a note from my study Bible, also on verse 1. So it's saying that she goes into the king's palace in front of the king's quarters while the king was sitting on his royal throne. And this note says that Esther stands where King Hazaris can see her and waits for him to either reject or receive her. This is a very tense moment, for she is risking her life. And we really talked a lot about that in chapter 4, why this was so risky and why she could lose her life for this. But this is a really key turning point in the story. Everything hinges on this moment, on what the king is going to do next. And Esther knows this. And I just imagine how terrified she must have been in that moment of deciding that this is what she was going to do no matter what, and that she was determined to act, but that it could cost her her life, that was a very real outcome of this that could potentially happen. And then next we see that when he saw her there, that she won favor in his sight. This is something that we have seen all throughout the book, that Esther wins favor first with the eunuch and then with the king. And now here in this very crucial moment, she wins favor with the king again. And this again is evidence of God's hand, that God turned the king's heart in such a way, or gave that favor to Esther so that this situation would go in her favor. And so it says that she won favor in his sight, and he held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. Then Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. So this scepter was essentially his invitation to her, of welcoming her in, of saying, it's okay, you can come and talk to me. The alternative would have been him having her taken off to be killed. And so this is the turning point in the story, the moment where she now has permission to go and talk to the king. A note I got from one of the sermons I listened to in preparation for this chapter said that Esther risked her life for the salvation of her people, and this ultimately points forward to Christ, who gave his life for the salvation of his people. And so everything is pointing forward to him. After King Ahasuerus grants Esther to come in, we see him saying to her in verse 3, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given to you, even up to the half of my kingdom." I think this just continues to paint that sort of character picture we're seeing of King Ahasuerus, of his impulsiveness or reactiveness, that he is telling her that she can have whatever she wants up to half the kingdom, and he has no idea what she's going to request. And also remember, like we talked about in chapter 4, this is his wife who he hasn't even seen in 30 days. And then he sees her and maybe she just looks really beautiful, or again, he has that favor for her and he's like, anything you want, it is yours. Another note on that from my study Bible says that the Greek historian Herodotus describes Ahasuerus as making such an offer, though on a different occasion. So this is something he had done before. Esther rightly understands it as a traditional grand gesture rather than one that the king expects to be taken seriously. And so maybe this wasn't a literal thing where she was going to be given up to half of his kingdom, but this was a grand gesture of sort of a hyperbole maybe, in a way to say anything you want, it is yours. And so Esther doesn't immediately come out with her ultimate request, but instead she first asks for a banquet. And a note from the Enduring Word commentary on this says that Esther showed tact by not blurting out her ultimate request right away. She wanted to first win the king's confidence in her, and she wanted Haman at the banquet to ultimately expose his wickedness. And so she requests this feast. Another note from my study Bible says that Esther had carefully planned what she would do if she was received favorably. By inviting Haman to the feast as well, she flatters him and sets him up for a colossal fall. So remember, just seconds earlier, Esther was in this tense moment where she knew that she could either 1, lose her life, or 2, be granted access to talk to the king. And so she's just gone through that major relief of, okay, I'm not going to be killed. And she had prepared what she was going to request. And it was this strategic feast to set her up for her ultimate request. And when Esther asks for this request, the king responds in verse 5 and says, "Bring Haman quickly so that we may do as Esther has asked." I don't really get the sense of urgency in Esther's request. She is saying, I would like for you to come to this feast today, but there isn't this sense of urgency really in her statement. But then in the king's response, he says, bring Haman quickly, like let's do this now. And again, I feel like that just kind of contributes to this sense of him being a really impulsive and reactive guy. So they go to this feast, they're drinking wine, and then the king says to Esther, okay, what is your wish? And Esther says, my wish is basically that we can do this same thing all over again tomorrow. Let's have another feast tomorrow for you, and also bring Haman. And a note on this from my study Bible says that another feast on the following day is what Esther requests. She bides her time as Haman had done. She puts Haman further off guard and makes sure the king is in the best possible mood before revealing what she ultimately wants. So after this first feast and the request for the second feast, it says in verse 9 that Haman went out joyfully and glad of heart, but then he passes by Mordecai in the king's gate, and it says that Mordecai neither rose nor trembled before him, and so Haman was filled with wrath against Mordecai. I think it's interesting that it says that he neither rose nor trembled, and that just tells us that Haman had this desire that Mordecai would either bow down to him, like we saw in the last chapter, his desire for that and his rage that that wasn't happening, or a desire for Mordecai to be fearful of him. Maybe because of this edict he had put out about destroying the Jews, he wanted to feel that sense of power over Mordecai, that Mordecai would tremble when he walked by. But Mordecai was neither. He was neither, praising or bowing down to Haman, but he also wasn't fearful of Haman, and he had no need to fear Haman because ultimately his trust was in the Lord. He wasn't afraid of what Haman could do to him because his trust was in God to act as God was going to act and to provide and deliver his people in this situation. And that just makes me think of Psalm 125:1, which says, "Those who trust in the Lord are like Mount Zion, which cannot be moved, but abides forever." That when our trust is firmly rooted in the Lord, that we're not going to be swayed by these circumstances that could cause us to fear, that could cause us to feel uncertain, that could cause us to doubt, because our trust is firmly rooted in him. So it says that Haman was filled with wrath against Mordecai, but then in verse 10, nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home. So basically he doesn't seek to kill Mordecai right then and there. And a note on this from the Enduring Word commentary says that this is remarkable evidence again of the hand of God. God would not allow the fury of Haman to take action until all the proper pieces were set in place to ultimately defeat his plan. And so it's God's hand, God's providence that Haman doesn't act right then and there because God is still setting those pieces in place. So Haman goes home and he sends for his friends and his wife Zeresh, and then he recounted to them, it says, the splendor of his riches, the number of his sons, which I think it's funny that he's recounting to his wife the number of his sons because you think she probably knows that information, and then all the promotions which the king had honored him with, how he had advanced him above the other officials and servants. And so he's basically just like puffing himself up in front of his wife and his friends. And I think in a way this is a very human reaction, that Haman feels slighted, I guess, by Mordecai, that it's kind of taken a little hit on his ego, and so he surrounds himself with those closest to him to sort of puff himself up and feel better. Obviously a very unhealthy approach to that though in this situation, but that is what he does. And so he's recounting these splendors, but then he basically says that these splendors mean nothing to him unless he takes Mordecai down, because he can't stand the fact that there is this one guy who will not sort of bow down to him and sort of give him the glory that he is craving. And a note on this from the Enduring Word commentary, it's actually a couple different notes, but I'm going to read them all because they're really, really good. But it says that that Haman was honored by both the king and the queen of Persia, but yet the disapproval of one man makes him feel worthless. This is an accurate description of how empty the rewards of this world are. Haman's deep-seated insecurities and need to be honored by everybody means that he can never be happy. God meant this hunger for acceptance in each of us to be ultimately fulfilled in Jesus Christ, because we are accepted in the beloved, like it talks about in Ephesians 1:6. Haman's problem wasn't Mordecai, but rather it was the emptiness in his own heart. Even if he solved the Mordecai problem, it would not fill the emptiness in his heart. And I just thought this was so insightful and so important, because Haman is chasing after this one guy who's not giving him the glory that he thinks he deserves, the glory that he craves, but ultimately that's never going to be fulfilled in other people for any of us, that it is something that it can only be fulfilled in God, and we're just going to keep chasing it and chasing it and chasing it apart from him. And so Haman says to his wife and his friends in verse 13, all of these splendors are worth nothing to me so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate. And then in verse 14 it says that his wife Zeresh and all of his friends said to him, why don't we just have this gallows 50 cubits high be built? And this would have been, I believe, about 75 feet. And in the morning, tell the king to have Mordecai hanged on this gallows. Then go joyfully to this second feast that Queen Esther has invited you to. I just think it's interesting that it wasn't enough to any of them to punish Mordecai's people, because remember, they already had this plan set in place to destroy all of the Jews, and it wasn't enough to merely kill Mordecai, but they wanted him to have a public, humiliating execution, which is what the really high gallows that they wanted to build speak to. It was this public, humiliating execution. And something I wrote here in the notes part of my journaling Bible, one of the previous times I read through this story, is that when you enable your loved one's pride, you do so to their detriment. And so Haman here was again coming to them from a place of pride and insecurity and just wanting to feel puffed up and get this glory for himself. And rather than kind of helping him in a more loving, truthful way, they're like, yeah, we're just gonna feed into this and puff you up and help you be prideful and help you take down this one person who is not giving you glory in the way that you want. And so they might have thought they were loving him, but as we're gonna see, them enabling his pride was ultimately to his detriment. This also makes me think of Proverbs 16:18, which says that pride goes before destruction and a haughty spirit before a fall. And so we see this peak point of pride right here, which is really insecurity at its root, and pride comes before the fall, which is what we are going to see. Finally, the chapter ends with the sentence that this idea pleased Haman and he had the gallows made. This was a quick turnaround time. He had those gallows made quickly in preparation for the next morning before the feast. And one final note on this from the Enduring Word commentary is that the same irrational, violent hatred that made Haman want to see Mordecai hang to his death is the same irrational, violent hatred that made man want to hang Jesus on a cross. Again, we're seeing all of these parallels, all of these things that ultimately point to Jesus, which is what this story ultimately points us to. So for this chapter, we're not going to be doing the further study section. Again, this was really just more of a narrative-based chapter. But as always, I encourage you to think about the things you learned from this chapter and spend some time responding to God in prayer and just, processing through and praying about these things. That is all for Esther chapter 5. Comment down below letting me know something that you learned or took away from this chapter, or maybe a standout point or verse. And then again, give this video a thumbs up if you are enjoying this study, and share it with a friend who you think would enjoy going through it as well. And I will see you back here next week for Esther chapter 6. Bye.